Some nights, the dead refuse to rest alone. My name is Director Chen, and I've managed Hillcrest Cemetery for 23 years. In all that time, I've learned that grief follows patterns. Fresh flowers on anniversaries, tears at headstones during holidays, the slow fade of visits as years pass and wounds heal. But Plot 42B broke every pattern I knew. The security system captured her first visit on a Tuesday in March. An elderly woman in a wool coat, moving with the careful steps of someone whose bones remember winter. She placed white roses at the grave marker and sat in her wheelchair for exactly 11 minutes before disappearing into the darkness beyond our camera's reach. At first, I assumed she was family. The grave belonged to Eleanor Vasquez, age 78, interred 6 months prior. Natural causes? Peaceful service? Nothing unusual in her file. But when the same woman appeared again the following Tuesday, at precisely 3:17 in the morning, I began paying attention. Week after week, the footage showed the same ritual. The woman would arrive, place fresh white roses, and sit in contemplative silence. Rain or shine, she never missed a Tuesday. Her visits became as reliable as the sunrise, though they occurred in the deepest part of night when even the most dedicated mourners were home in bed. By June, curiosity overtook professional discretion. I decided to wait for her next visit and introduce myself. Perhaps she was Eleanor's sister, someone too proud to visit during daylight when other mourners might see her tears. I'd encountered stranger grief rituals in my years managing the cemetery. Tuesday arrived with unseasonable chill. I parked near the maintenance shed and walked the gravel path toward Plot 42B, carrying a thermos of coffee and wearing my heaviest jacket. The cemetery felt different at night, not frightening exactly, but expectant, as if the darkness held its breath. At 3:15, I positioned myself behind the old oak tree that overlooked Eleanor's section. The woman appeared 2 minutes later, emerging from the shadows between graves like she'd materialized from the earth itself. Even from 30 feet away, I could see the familiar white roses cradled in her lap. She maneuvered her wheelchair to the graveside with practiced ease and placed the flowers with reverent care. Then she sat back and began to speak. Her voice too soft for me to catch words, but clear enough to recognize the cadence of conversation. She was talking to Eleanor, sharing what sounded like neighborhood gossip and family updates. After 10 minutes, I stepped from behind the tree. "Good evening," I called softly, not wanting to startle her. She didn't respond, didn't even turn toward my voice. I walked closer, my footsteps crunching on the gravel path. "Ma'am, I'm Director Chen. I manage the cemetery." Still, nothing. She continued her one-sided conversation, occasionally nodding as if Eleanor were responding. The roses at the grave's base seemed to glow in the moonlight, their petals fresh despite the week that had passed since her last visit. When I reached the wheelchair, my blood turned to ice water. The chair was empty, not just unoccupied, completely empty. No blanket, no purse, no elderly woman in a wool coat, just worn leather seats and chrome armrests catching starlight. The voice continued, coming from the space above the chair where she should have been sitting, but there was nothing there except night air and the scent of roses. I stumbled backward, my rational mind scrambling for explanations. Trick of shadows, stress hallucination, too much coffee and too little sleep. But the voice kept talking, discussing someone named Margaret's hip surgery and how the new pastor at St. Mary's gave sermons that ran too long. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone and activated its flashlight. The beam revealed the empty wheelchair in stark detail. Real chrome, real leather, real enough to cast shadows on Eleanor's headstone. But still no woman, just her voice, growing fainter as my presence seemed to register in whatever realm she occupied. The conversation stopped mid-sentence. Silence settled over the cemetery, like a held breath. The wheelchair sat motionless, its occupant gone in every sense except the lingering warmth I could feel radiating from the empty seat. I reached out tentatively and touched the armrest. The metal was body-warm, as if someone had been gripping it moments before. I spent the rest of that night in my office, reviewing security footage and personnel records. The cameras showed my own arrival and patrol clearly, but they revealed nothing else. No elderly woman, no wheelchair, no explanation for what I'd experienced. Just empty gravel paths and my own confused figure searching shadows. The next morning, I pulled Eleanor Vasquez's burial file. Standard documentation, all in order. But tucked behind the death certificate, I found something that stopped my coffee cup halfway to my lips, a faded newspaper clipping from 1987. Local woman dies in cemetery accident. Read the headline. The article described how Margaret Vasquez, age 74, had suffered a heart attack while visiting her sister Eleanor's grave. She'd been found the next morning, slumped in her wheelchair beside the headstone, white roses scattered around her. Eleanor Vasquez had died in 1987. The woman I'd buried 6 months ago had been someone else entirely, someone who'd purchased the plot without knowing its history. I never saw Margaret again, though security footage occasionally captures an empty wheelchair moving along the cemetery paths on Tuesday nights. The roses still appear, fresh and white, placed with invisible hands that remember love stronger than death. Some nights, when the wind is right, I hear her voice drifting across the graves, still sharing news with Eleanor, still keeping promises that transcend the boundaries between this world and whatever lies beyond. The dead, I've learned, have their own visiting schedules, and some appointments are kept for eternity. The dead are supposed to be still, but Mrs. Henley had other plans. I'm Rosa Martinez, and I've been an embalmer at Peaceful Rest Funeral Home for 15 years. The work suits me: quiet, methodical, respectful. There's dignity in preparing someone for their final rest, in making sure families can say goodbye to something that looks peaceful rather than pained. The dead don't judge, don't rush you, don't complain about your technique. They're the best clients you could ask for. Mrs. Henley arrived on a Thursday afternoon in late September. Natural causes, the paperwork said. 83 years old, survived by 2 daughters and a grandson who lived in California. She'd been a librarian for 40 years, never married, kept cats, the kind of quiet life that deserved a quiet ending. Her daughters were specific about the arrangement's closed casket service, but they wanted to see her before the viewing. That meant my best work. Subtle makeup, natural positioning, peaceful expression. I scheduled her preparation for Friday evening after regular hours, when the funeral home would be empty and I could work without interruption. The preparation room felt colder than usual that night. Our heating system had been acting up, but this was different. The kind of cold that settles into your bones and doesn't leave. I adjusted the thermostat twice before giving up and pulling on a sweater over my scrubs. Mrs. Henley lay on the preparation table exactly as the transport team had left her. Her face was serene, eyes closed, hands folded across her chest. Death had been gentle with her, leaving few signs of the struggle that sometimes marks the end. I began my work with the respect she deserved, speaking to her softly as I always did with the deceased. Some people think it's morbid, but I believe dignity doesn't end with the last heartbeat. The arterial preparation went smoothly. Mrs. Henley's tissue accepted the preservation fluid well, and the natural color returned to her face with professional satisfaction. I set her features carefully, a slight upturn to her lips that suggested contentment, hands positioned as if she were simply resting. Her daughters would see peace when they said goodbye. I finished around 10 o'clock and locked the preparation room, as was protocol. The funeral home's security system armed automatically at 10:30, cameras recording every hallway and room. Mrs. Henley would rest undisturbed until morning, when I'd return to do her hair and apply the final touches before her daughter's visit. Saturday morning brought unseasonable warmth, the kind of Indian summer day that makes you forget winter is coming. I arrived at 7 with coffee and fresh flowers for the viewing room, humming an old song my grandmother used to sing. The security system's green light indicated no overnight disturbances, Everything was exactly as it should be, except in the preparation room. Mrs. Henley's head had turned completely to the right, facing the door I'd locked the night before. Not a subtle shift that might be explained by settling a full 90-degree rotation that put her gaze directly on anyone entering the room. Her peaceful expression remained unchanged, but her eyes were open now, pale blue, and fixed on the doorway with unmistakable intent. My hands trembled as I set down my coffee. 15 years of experience told me this was impossible. Bodies don't reposition themselves after rigor mortis sets in. They don't open their eyes spontaneously. They don't turn to watch doors like they're expecting visitors. I checked the security log on my phone. No alarms, no unauthorized entry, no record of anyone in the building after I'd left. The room's temperature was normal now, comfortable even, as if whatever cold had settled there the night before had moved on to other business. But Mrs. Henley kept staring at the door. I tried to rationalize it. Gas movement in the tissues, delayed muscle contraction, some textbook explanation that would make this make sense. But as I approached the table, her eyes seemed to track my movement with the kind of awareness that belongs only to the living. "Mrs. Henley," I whispered, feeling foolish but compelled to speak. "What are you trying to tell me?" Her expression didn't change, but the room grew cold again. Not the gradual chill of air conditioning, but the instant drop of temperature that comes when you open a freezer door. My breath misted as I leaned closer, searching her face for some explanation. That's when I saw it. A single tear, fresh and warm, tracking down her left cheek. I stumbled backward, my rational mind rejecting what my eyes couldn't deny. The dead don't cry. They don't position themselves to watch doorways. They don't radiate the kind of desperate attention that was coming from Mrs. Henley's still form in waves I could almost feel. But something had happened in that preparation room during the long hours of night. Something that left her forever changed. I called my supervisor, voice shaking as I explained the situation. "Bodies sometimes shift," he said calmly. "Settlement, gas, natural processes. Nothing unusual about it, Rosa. Just reposition her and continue your work." I tried. Spent 20 minutes attempting to turn Mrs. Henley's head back to its proper position, but her neck had stiffened in the new angle. Every time I managed to move her face toward the ceiling, it would slowly rotate back to the door, like she was keeping watch, like she was waiting for someone. The viewing went ahead as scheduled. Mrs. Henley's daughters wept appropriately, held her hands, whispered their goodbyes. They commented on how peaceful she looked, how natural. If they noticed their mother's gaze was fixed on the viewing room's entrance instead of the ceiling, they didn't mention it. But I noticed. And I noticed other things too, how mourners would glance nervously toward the casket, then look away quickly. How the room stayed cold despite the heating system's best efforts. How flowers wilted faster than they should, their petals dropping like tears onto the carpet. Mrs. Henley was buried on Sunday morning. The service was brief, well attended by former library patrons who remembered her kindness. As they lowered her casket into the ground, I found myself wondering what she'd been watching for during those final hours at the funeral home. I got my answer the following Tuesday. Mrs. Henley's grandson finally made it from California for a private graveside service. As he knelt beside her headstone, placing a book of poetry she'd given him as a child, I understood why she'd spent her last night among us with her eyes on the door. She'd been waiting for him to come home and say goodbye. Fear doesn't die with the body, sometimes it just finds new ways to breathe. My name is Kyle Brennan, and I'm a funeral assistant at Evergreen Memorial Chapel. Been working here 3 years now, ever since I graduated from mortuary school. It's honest work, helping families through their worst moments, making sure everything runs smoothly when grief makes simple tasks feel impossible. Most days, I find purpose in it, dignity in the small details that matter when someone you love is gone forever. Room 7 is our smallest viewing space, reserved for intimate services or when larger rooms are occupied. It's painted in soft blues and grays, with comfortable seating for about 20 people. The lighting is warm but respectful, designed to make the deceased look peaceful, while allowing families to gather close for their final farewells. Mr. David Kowalski was scheduled for Room 7 viewing on a Wednesday in October. He died suddenly of a heart attack at age 59, leaving behind a wife and adult daughter who'd driven down from Portland for the service. The arrangements were straightforward one-day viewing, closed casket at the family's request, burial the following morning at St. Joseph's Cemetery. Tuesday evening, I prepared Room 7 with particular care. Mr. Kowalski's casket was positioned at the front of the room, surrounded by floral arrangements sent by co-workers from the accounting firm where he'd worked for 26 years. I tested all the lighting, arranged chairs for optimal flow, and made sure the room's temperature was comfortable. Everything perfect for a family saying goodbye. The casket lock mechanism was solid brass, designed to secure the lid during viewing and transport. I engaged it personally, checking twice to ensure it was properly sealed. Mr. Kowalski's wife had been adamant about the closed casket, something about her husband's fear of enclosed spaces, how he'd made her promise years ago that he'd never be trapped anywhere, even in death. I understood the sentiment. Claustrophobia doesn't always make rational sense, but grief demands we honor the fears of the living and the dead alike. Wednesday morning brought the first sign something was wrong. When I unlocked Room 7 to do a final check before the family arrived, I found the casket lid raised about 2 inches. Not thrown open dramatically, just cracked enough to let in light and air. The brass lock hung loose, as if someone had carefully disengaged it from the inside. My first thought was mechanical failure. These old locks sometimes slip under pressure, especially when temperature changes cause metal to expand and contract. I secured the lid again, tested the mechanism twice, and made a mental note to have maintenance inspected after the service. But Thursday morning, the same thing happened. The casket was open exactly 2 inches. Brass lock disengaged, positioned as if Mr. Kowalski had somehow pushed against the lid until it gave way. This time I examined the mechanism more carefully, looking for stress fractures or worn components that might explain the failure. Everything appeared normal, solid construction, properly aligned, no obvious defects. I called maintenance anyway. Jerry Voss, our handyman for the past decade, spent an hour examining the lock. "Never seen one fail like this," he said, working the mechanism with professional puzzlement. "It's like someone pushed from the inside, but that's..." He didn't finish the thought. We both knew what was impossible and what wasn't. Friday brought Mr. Kowalski's funeral, and his family arrived early for a private moment before the service began. His daughter, Sarah, was a composed woman in her 30s, who'd clearly inherited her father's practical nature. But when she entered Room 7, something in her demeanor shifted. "Is the casket supposed to be unlocked?" she asked, running her fingers along the brass mechanism. I assured her it was secure, but she shook her head. "No, I can feel it. It's loose. Dad always said he couldn't stand being locked up anywhere. Even our house, he never used the deadbolt. Said it made him feel trapped." Her mother nodded sadly. "The claustrophobia got worse as he got older. He made me promise that if anything happened to him, he wouldn't be contained. I know it sounds strange, but I said we'd keep the casket unlocked during viewing hours." That explained everything and nothing at all. I spent the rest of that day leaving the casket unlocked during viewing hours, as the family requested. The service went beautifully, full of stories about Mr. Kowalski's kindness and his legendary fear of enclosed spaces. Co-workers remembered how he always took the stairs instead of elevators, how he'd leave meetings if the conference room felt too small, how he'd moved his desk closer to the window because cubicles made him nervous. But that night, after the viewing ended, and the family had gone home to prepare for burial, I found myself facing a dilemma. Funeral home protocol required secured caskets overnight. Insurance, liability, basic professionalism, all demanded that I engage the brass lock one final time. I stood in Room 7 for 10 minutes, hand hovering over the mechanism. Finally, respect for the dead won over policy. Mr. Kowalski had spent his entire life fighting the fear of being trapped. I couldn't bring myself to lock him in for his last night among the living. I left the casket unlocked and went home. Saturday morning, I arrived early to prepare for the burial service. Room 7 was exactly as I'd left it. Casket slightly open, flowers arranged peacefully, everything in order. But the room felt different somehow. Warmer, more satisfied. If a room could feel satisfaction. As I prepared to close the casket for final transport, I noticed something that stopped me cold. The interior silk lining around the edges was wrinkled, as if someone had been pushing against it from the inside. Not violently, not desperately, but persistently. Like someone testing boundaries, making sure they weren't truly trapped. Mr. Kowalski was buried that afternoon, with full honors. The casket remained unlocked until the moment it was lowered into the ground, his final wish honored, even in death. I never told anyone about the wrinkled silk lining, or the nights I'd left him unlocked. Some secrets are meant to rest with the dead. But ever since then, when families mention claustrophobia or ask for special accommodations, I listen with different ears. Fear doesn't always die with the body. Sometimes it just needs to know there's still a way out. Dead phones shouldn't ring, but mine kept collecting messages from the grave. I'm Wade Thompson, transport driver for Morrison Family Mortuary. 7 years now, driving the route between hospitals, nursing homes, and our facility. It's not glamorous work picking up the deceased at all hours, treating them with dignity during their final journey, but someone has to do it. Someone has to make sure they get where they're going safely, even when where they're going is the end of everything they knew. My work phone is a basic model, nothing fancy. Company policy requires we keep it on 24/7 for emergency calls. Middle of the night pickups, last-minute transport changes, families who need to reach us when grief makes waiting impossible. The phone stays charged, volume turned up, always ready for the next call. It started with Mrs. Eleanor Vance. I'd picked her up from Mercy General on a Tuesday evening in November. 91 years old. Peaceful passing, surrounded by family who'd said their goodbyes over the course of a long illness. She was tiny in the transport bag, barely weighing 90 pounds, fragile as a bird that had simply stopped singing. The drive to Morrison's took 20 minutes, through quiet suburban streets, lined with houses where people were settling down to dinner, watching television, living the ordinary life. Mrs. Vance would never live again. Thursday morning, exactly 72 hours after I'd driven her from the hospital, my work phone rang. The caller ID showed her number. I stared at the display, certain I was misreading it. But no, there it was. The 10-digit number from Mrs. Vance's file. The landline that had been disconnected when her family cleaned out her apartment 2 days prior. The phone rang 4 times before going to voicemail. When I played the message, I heard breathing. Not the ragged gasps of someone struggling to speak, but calm, steady breaths, like someone sleeping peacefully. The message lasted exactly 30 seconds, then ended with a soft click that sounded almost satisfied. I told myself it was a glitch. Phone companies make mistakes. Numbers get reassigned. Old connections sometimes ghost through the system, creating strange echoes of calls that were never meant to be made. Technology isn't perfect, especially when dealing with discontinued lines and automated systems that don't always know when someone has died. But then it happened with Robert Chen. I'd transported him from his home on a Saturday morning. Another peaceful passing. Cancer. Finally winning the fight he'd been waging for 2 years. His son had been with him at the end, holding his hand while hospice workers made sure he was comfortable. Mr. Chen was 78, a retired engineer who'd built bridges for 40 years before his body built one he couldn't cross. Monday evening, his number called my work phone. Same pattern. 4 rings, then voicemail. Same message, 30 seconds of steady breathing, then that soft click. This time I saved the recording and played it for my supervisor, Jim Morrison, whose family had been in the funeral business for 4 generations. Prank call, Jim said after listening. Someone gets hold of a dead person's number, thinks it's funny to mess with the mortuary staff. Happens more than you'd think. Just block the number and forget about it. But I couldn't forget about it. And I couldn't block the numbers, because they kept changing. Margaret Riley called on Wednesday night, exactly 72 hours after I'd driven her from Sunset Manor to our facility. Thomas Kowalski called Saturday morning, breathing steadily into my voicemail while I stood in my kitchen drinking coffee and trying to pretend this was normal. Each call came precisely 3 days after transport. Each lasted exactly 30 seconds. Each ended with that same soft click of satisfaction. By December, I'd received calls from 11 different dead people. The messages were always identical. Peaceful breathing. No words. Just the sound of air moving in and out of lungs that should have been still. I started keeping a log, recording dates and times, looking for patterns that might explain what was happening. The calls always came between 6 in the evening and midnight. Always lasted 30 seconds. Always from numbers that had been disconnected days before. I stopped answering my work phone after hours. That didn't stop the calls from coming. My voicemail filled up with messages from the dead, each one a testament to breathing that shouldn't exist. I'd lie awake listening to them, trying to understand what they were trying to communicate. Were they reassuring me they were at peace? Warning me about something? Or were they simply checking in, making sure I remembered them beyond their final ride in my van? On Christmas Eve, I transported Anna Martinez from her daughter's house to Morrison's. She'd died quietly in her sleep at age 95, surrounded by 4 generations of family who'd gathered for the holiday. Her great-granddaughter, maybe 6 years old, had touched Anna's hand and whispered, "Don't forget us, Abuela." 3 days later, Anna called, but this time was different. This time, along with the breathing, I heard something else in the background of her message, faint but unmistakable. Christmas music. Silent Night, played on what sounded like an old music box. The kind that might have been a gift from children decades ago. That's when I understood. The calls weren't random. They weren't pranks or technical glitches or my imagination running wild from too many nights driving empty roads with cargo that used to be people. They were connection calls. The dead, reaching out one final time to the last person who'd been with them in the world of the living. Me, the stranger who'd driven them gently from life to whatever comes after. I stopped being afraid of the calls after that. Started answering when I recognized the numbers, though there was never conversation, just that peaceful breathing, that reassurance that wherever they'd gone, they were still themselves in some essential way, still remembering their final journey, still grateful for the dignity I'd tried to give them in those last miles. The calls still come. My work phone rings with numbers that shouldn't work anymore, carrying messages from people who shouldn't be able to dial. I listen to each one. 30 seconds of breathing that tells me more about peace than any sermon I've ever heard. Last week, Anna Martinez called again. This time, after the breathing, I heard her great-granddaughter's voice, impossibly distant but clear. "She didn't forget us, did she, Abuela?" The call ended with that soft click of satisfaction. The earth remembers every hand that ever tried to claw its way back to the surface. I'm Marion Keys, groundskeeper at Oakwood Cemetery for the past 12 years. It's peaceful work most of the time, maintaining the grounds, keeping the grass trimmed, making sure headstones stand straight and flower arrangements look respectful. There's dignity in caring for the final resting places of the dead, ensuring their families can visit somewhere beautiful when they need to remember love that transcends death. The handprints started appearing in late October, just after the first frost. I noticed them during my morning rounds, checking for overnight damage or litter that might have blown in from the street. 5 perfect handprints, pressed into the soft soil above grave sites. Always the same pattern. 4 fingers and a thumb, adult-sized, pressed from underneath as if someone had been lying on their back and pushing up against 6 feet of earth. At first, I assumed vandalism. Teenagers sometimes think cemeteries make good party spots, and they don't always respect the solemnity of the place. But these prints were too perfect, too deliberate, made with care rather than mischief, and they appeared on graves that dated back decades, long-settled plots where the soil should have been compacted hard as concrete. The first set appeared over Martha Henderson's grave. She'd been buried in 1973 according to her headstone. Beloved wife and mother. The inscription read, though I'd never seen anyone visit her in all my years maintaining the grounds. The handprints in her grave dirt looked fresh, the soil loose and dark, as if it had been recently turned. But we hadn't done any maintenance on that section in months. I photographed the prints and smoothed the soil, chalking it up to some kind of settling or frost damage. Ground shifts sometimes create unusual patterns, especially during seasonal temperature changes. Nothing supernatural about Earth behaving like Earth. But the next morning, they were back. Same location, same perfect impression of desperate fingers pressed against the underside of the world. This time I examined them more carefully, noting how the palm prints showed lines and creases, how the fingertip impressions revealed the whorls of individual prints. These weren't random soil disturbances or animal tracks. They were human hands, reaching up from below with purposeful intent. I called my supervisor, Tom Bradley, who'd been managing Oakwood for 30 years. He listened to my description with the patient skepticism of someone who'd heard every strange story a cemetery could generate. Probably just frost heave, he said. When ground freezes and thaws, it can push up in weird patterns. I've seen soil form all kinds of shapes, handprints, footprints, even what looked like faces once. Nature's got a sense of humor about these things. I wanted to believe him. Spent the rest of that week smoothing disturbed soil and telling myself Tom was right. But the handprints kept appearing, always in the same perfect formation, always over graves of people who died decades ago. Never fresh burials, never recent plots. Only the old dead, the long forgotten, the ones whose stories had been buried as deep as their bones. By November, I documented handprints over 17 different graves. Each set was unique, different hand sizes, different finger lengths, different palm shapes, but all showed the same desperate upward reach, the same attempt to push through earth that should have been final. I started carrying a camera during my morning rounds, photographing each occurrence before smoothing the soil and pretending everything was normal. The patterns began to make sense when I started researching the names on the headstones. Martha Henderson, buried 1973. Cause of death listed as cardiac arrest. But the newspaper archives told a different story. She'd been found dead in her basement laundry room, apparently overcome by carbon monoxide from a faulty furnace. Her husband had been at work, her children at school. She'd died alone, calling for help that never came. Robert Vance, 1968, official cause, drowning. But the details revealed he'd been trapped in his car during a flash flood, water rising slowly around him, while rescue workers tried desperately to break through the windows. He died with his hands pressed against the glass, watching help arrive too late. Eleanor Morris, 1959. Suffocation during house fire. She'd been found in her bedroom closet, where she'd hidden from the smoke and flames that eventually found her anyway. Her hands had been clawed raw from trying to break through the closet door. Every grave with handprints belonged to someone who died, trapped. People who'd spent their final moments fighting confinement, clawing at barriers they couldn't break, reaching for freedom that remained just out of grasp. And now, decades later, their hands were still reaching up through soil and time, testing the boundaries of their final prison. I stopped smoothing the handprints after that, started leaving them undisturbed, little monuments to desperation that transcended death. Visitors occasionally asked about them, but I just mentioned frost patterns and soil settling. The truth was too strange, too sad for most people to carry. But one morning in December, I found something that changed everything. Fresh handprints over Martha Henderson's grave. Same as always. But this time, the soil around them was disturbed differently. Not pressed up from below, but smooth from above. As if someone had been kneeling beside the grave, gently covering the reaching hands with loose earth like a blanket. Footprints in the frost led away from Martha's headstone's small prints, a woman's shoes, heading toward the cemetery's old section where the oldest graves stood, weathered and forgotten. I followed them to a headstone I'd never paid much attention to. Sarah Henderson, beloved daughter, 1949 to 1973. Martha's daughter had been visiting her mother's grave, but according to the records, Sarah Henderson had died the same day as her mother, carbon monoxide poisoning. Same basement laundry room. They'd been found together, holding hands in death as they'd faced the end together. The footprints ended at Sarah's grave, where fresh soil had been smoothed over handprints that were already fading into the earth. Mother and daughter finally together again, no longer reaching up through the dark alone. I still find handprints on graves throughout Oakwood, marking the resting places of people who died fighting confinement. But now I also find evidence of comfort, soil smoothed by invisible hands, flowers that appear overnight, signs that the long dead are caring for each other in ways the living never could. The earth remembers every desperate reach, every final struggle, but it also remembers every gentle touch, every act of love that bridges the space between graves and makes the darkness a little less alone. Love doesn't stop blooming just because the gardener dies. My name is Ben Morrison, cemetery caretaker at Hillside Memorial Gardens. 21 years I've been walking these paths, maintaining the grounds, making sure families can visit their loved ones in a place that honors memory with beauty. It's quiet work, mostly trimming hedges, planting seasonal flowers, keeping the peace that people need when they come to grieve. Grave 156C belongs to Dorothy Whitman, interred in June of 2004. According to her headstone, she lived 87 years and was beloved wife, mother, and master gardener. Her family had planted white lilies around her grave, the same flowers she'd grown in her backyard for 60 years. According to the groundskeeper who'd worked here before me, the lilies bloomed beautifully that first summer, then died back naturally with the first frost. Normal cycle for perennials. We covered the plot with mulch for winter protection, expecting them to return the following spring. Some did, but not many. By Dorothy's second year, only a few straggly stems pushed through the soil around her headstone. By the third year, they were gone entirely. Her son Michael visited every few months, usually bringing fresh flowers from the grocery store, carnations, roses, whatever looked good that week. He'd stand at her grave for 10 or 15 minutes, sometimes talking softly about his kids or work troubles, sometimes just standing in the kind of silence that comes from missing someone more than words can express. I'd been working here 8 years when the mysterious flowers started appearing. Tuesday morning, October 15th, 2012. I was doing my usual rounds when I noticed fresh white lilies beside Dorothy's headstone. Beautiful specimens, tall stems, perfect blooms, the kind of flowers that come from someone who knows what they're doing in the garden. They looked like they'd been placed there moments before, petals still holding morning dew. My first thought was that Michael had visited early, maybe stopped by before work to avoid the emotional weight of a longer visit. But the flowers weren't arranged like funeral bouquet, they were planted. Root systems intact, soil carefully packed around them, positioned with the kind of precision that comes from years of gardening experience. I checked our work orders. No landscaping scheduled for that section. No record of family requesting new plantings. The flowers were just there, as if they'd grown overnight from soil that had been barren for years. I mentioned it to my supervisor, Rick Henley, during our weekly meeting. Maybe the sun planted them, Rick suggested. People sometimes do work on graves without telling us. As long as they're not damaging anything, we usually let it slide. That seemed reasonable. Grief makes people want to take action. To do something tangible when talking to headstones feels insufficient. Maybe Michael had decided his mother's grave needed the flowers she'd loved in life. But the next Tuesday, more lilies appeared. Same location, same expert planting, same impossible timing. These weren't additions to the previous week's flowers. They were entirely new plantings in spots where nothing had grown the day before. 6 perfectly positioned white lilies, arranged with the kind of eye for design that transforms a gravesite into a garden. I started paying closer attention to Dorothy's grave during my rounds. The lilies always appeared on Tuesday mornings, always between my Monday evening check and Tuesday dawn patrol. Never any sign of disturbance. No footprints in the soft earth around the headstone. No indication that anyone had been working there during the night hours. By November, Dorothy's grave looked like something from a gardening magazine. Dozens of white lilies in perfect arrangements, each one healthy and thriving despite the approaching winter. Other graves in the section remained dormant, their flowers long since withered by frost. But Dorothy's plot bloomed as if it were still high summer. I decided to check the security footage. Hillside installed cameras 5 years ago after some vandalism incidents. Motion-activated units that record anyone moving through the cemetery after hours. The camera covering section 156 had a clear view of Dorothy's grave, good enough to catch anyone working there during the night. I spent an afternoon reviewing Tuesday night footage, fast-forwarding through hours of empty cemetery paths and sleeping headstones. Nothing unusual until 3:01 in the morning, when something appeared in the corner of the frame. Not someone, something. The footage showed flowers materializing beside Dorothy's headstone, not being planted, just appearing, one by one, as if invisible hands were placing them with careful deliberation. Perfect white lilies emerging from thin air, roots settling into soil that welcomed them like old friends. I watched the sequence frame by frame, looking for some explanation, technical glitch, camera malfunction, anything that made more sense than flowers manifesting themselves through supernatural gardening. But the footage was clear, the timestamp accurate, the impossible undeniable. Dorothy Whitman was still tending her garden. I stopped trying to rationalize it after that. Started looking forward to Tuesday mornings, checking to see what new arrangements had appeared overnight. The flowers followed seasonal patterns, more blooms in spring and summer, fewer during winter months, but always something beautiful marking her resting place. Michael noticed during his Christmas visit. Dad used to say Mom could grow anything, he told me, running his fingers along lily petals that shouldn't have existed in December. Even after she got too sick to work in the garden, she'd sit by the window and tell him exactly how to water her plants, where to place them for the best light. Guess some habits don't die easy. I agreed, though I didn't mention what the security cameras revealed every Tuesday at 3 in the morning. The flowers still appear. Dorothy's grave remains the most beautiful spot in Hillside Memorial Gardens, a testament to love that transcends death, and hands that remember how to nurture life, even when they're no longer visible. Visitors often comment on the incredible landscaping, asking who maintains such gorgeous arrangements. I just smile and tell them it's the work of someone who really knew flowers. Because some gardeners never retire, even when their earthly work is done. They just find new ways to keep the beauty alive, one mysterious bloom at a time. Some bodies refuse to accept that life is over. I'm Elena Vasquez, mortician at Restful Meadows Funeral Home for the past 9 years. The work requires precision, maintaining proper temperatures, following health protocols, ensuring bodies are preserved with dignity, while families make their arrangements. It's technical work, but it's also deeply human. Every person on my preparation tables was someone's everything, and they deserve respect even in death. Body number 47 arrived on a Wednesday evening in February. John Patrick Sullivan, age 62, massive heart attack while shoveling snow in his driveway. His wife had found him an hour later, still clutching the shovel handle, snow falling gently on his face. A sudden death, but peaceful, no suffering, no long illness, just here one moment and gone the next. The transport team brought him in around 9 o'clock, paperwork in order, family arrangements scheduled for the weekend. Standard procedure meant immediate refrigeration until I could begin preparation work the following day. Our cold storage units maintain a steady 38 degrees, enough to preserve tissue integrity while preventing decomposition. I assigned Mr. Sullivan to Unit 4, our most reliable refrigeration chamber. The temperature gauge showed 38 degrees, exactly as I secured the door and updated the log. Everything normal, everything by the book. Just another person beginning their final rest in the controlled environment that would keep them peaceful until their families could say goodbye. Thursday morning brought the first anomaly. Unit 4's thermometer read 98.6 degrees normal human body temperature, despite the refrigeration system running perfectly. I checked the other units. All maintained proper temperature. Only Mr. Sullivan's chamber had warmed, as if something inside was generating its own heat. I opened the unit immediately, expecting to find mechanical failure or a breach in the seal. But the chamber's interior felt properly cold, the walls and surfaces maintaining refrigeration temperature. Only Mr. Sullivan himself radiated warmth, his skin feeling exactly like living flesh when I touched his arm to check for changes. My thermometer confirmed what my hands already knew. While the surrounding air stayed cold, Mr. Sullivan's body maintained 98.6 degrees, the temperature of life. I called our maintenance contractor, explaining the situation as a possible insulation problem or thermostat malfunction. Dave Chen arrived within an hour, spending the morning testing refrigeration lines and temperature sensors. Everything checked out perfectly. Never seen anything like it, Dave said, scratching his head as he reviewed his readings. The unit's working fine, but your guy's running a fever. That's not supposed to happen to dead people. I moved Mr. Sullivan to Unit 2, thinking perhaps there was some problem with Unit 4 that our instruments couldn't detect. Same result within an hour. His body temperature climbed back to 98.6, while the surrounding chamber remained properly cold. By Friday afternoon, I'd tried 3 different refrigeration units. Same impossible result every time. More concerning were the other signs of warmth I'd begun to notice. Condensation forming around Mr. Sullivan's mouth, as if he were breathing. Slight color in his cheeks that suggested blood circulation. A softness to his features that preserved tissue should have lost within hours of death. I'd worked with hundreds of bodies over 9 years. I knew what death looked like, how it changed human tissue, the inevitable processes that begin the moment the heart stops beating. Mr. Sullivan's body was rejecting every law of decomposition I'd ever learned. Saturday brought the funeral, and I faced a professional crisis. How do you explain to a grieving family that their husband and father was behaving like he was still alive, just sleeping? How do you prepare someone for viewing when they look healthier in death than many people do in life? Mrs. Sullivan arrived early for a private moment before the service. She was a small woman in her 50s, who'd clearly spent the past 3 days crying and not sleeping. But when she saw her husband in the casket, her grief shifted to confusion. He looked she paused, searching for words. So warm, like he's just napping on the couch after a big dinner. She reached out to touch his hand, then pulled back quickly. He feels warm too. Is that normal? I assured her that our preparation process sometimes created that effect, though I'd never encountered anything like Mr. Sullivan's condition. She seemed comforted by the explanation, but I could see questions in her eyes that I couldn't answer. The funeral service went beautifully. Mr. Sullivan looked peaceful, natural, almost alive in his casket. Mourners commented on how well he looked, how the heart attack hadn't left any visible signs of trauma. If they noticed his unusual warmth, they attributed it to the funeral home's heating system or their own emotional state. But I noticed other things during the service. The slight rise and fall of his chest so subtle it might have been imagination. The way his features seemed to soften when his wife spoke about their 40-year marriage. The condensation that kept forming on the casket's interior glass. Despite the cool February air, after the burial, I researched everything I could find about post-mortem temperature regulation. Medical journals, forensic texts, anything that might explain why a dead man's body would maintain living temperature for 4 days. I found nothing that matched Mr. Sullivan's condition. The answer came from an unexpected source, his obituary, in the local newspaper. John Sullivan was known for his incredible warmth, it read. In 40 years as a high school guidance counselor, he never met a troubled kid he couldn't help. His office was always open. His advice always given with genuine care. Students would say that talking to Mr. Sullivan was like being wrapped in a warm blanket on the coldest day. His wife had included quotes from former students, now adults, with children of their own. Mr. Sullivan saved my life when I was 16, wrote one. He was the warmest person I ever knew, said another. He had this way of making you feel like everything would be okay, just by being there. I understood then. Some people carry so much warmth in life that death can't cool them immediately. They've spent decades heating the world around them, helping others through cold moments of despair. That kind of warmth doesn't extinguish just because the heart stops beating. Mr. Sullivan's body had finally cooled by the following Wednesday, exactly 1 week after his death. Normal temperature, normal tissue response, everything as it should be medically. But for 7 days, he'd remained warm, a final gift to a wife who needed to feel his warmth one last time, to children who needed their father to feel alive during their goodbye. I still check body temperatures religiously, hoping to find another case like Mr. Sullivan's. Not because I want to solve some medical mystery, but because I want to believe that love generates its own heat, and some people are too warm-hearted for death to cool them quickly. The thermometer doesn't lie, but neither does the heart. Children know when someone is calling them home. My name is James Morrison, funeral director at Morrison Family Chapel, following in my father's footsteps and his father's before him. 4 generations of Morrisons have guided families through their darkest hours, helping them say goodbye with dignity and grace. It's sacred work, especially when we're caring for the smallest among us children, whose lives ended far too soon. The preparation room door has always been solid oak, installed when my grandfather built the chapel in 1952. Heavy wood, brass hinges that close with authority, a lock that clicks shut with the finality that such spaces require. For 70 years, that door has stayed closed during services, maintaining the separation between the living gathered to mourn and the sacred work of preparation happening beyond, until we started hosting services for children. The first time it happened was during Emma Chen's viewing. 7 years old, leukemia, a bright little girl whose laugh had filled our chapel during the planning meetings when her parents discussed flowers and music. The viewing room was full of her classmates and their families, people struggling to understand how someone so young could be taken so suddenly. I was halfway through the eulogy when the preparation room door began to open. Not dramatically, just a slow, steady creak as it swung inward about 6 inches, enough to break the seal, to create a gap between the world of the living and whatever lay beyond. I paused mid-sentence, glancing toward the door with professional concern. Mechanical issue, probably. Old hinges sometimes slip when temperature changes cause wood to expand. But Emma's mother noticed too. Sarah Chen turned in her front row seat, her grief-stricken face suddenly alert. "She's calling us," she whispered, so softly I almost missed it. "Emma's calling us to come with her." I finished the eulogy with one eye on the door, which remained exactly 6 inches open for the rest of the service. When I checked afterward, the lock was still engaged, the hinges showed no signs of wear, and the door closed normally when I tested it. No mechanical explanation for what had happened. 3 weeks later, we held services for Michael Rodriguez, age 4, drowning accident, at a neighborhood pool. Same thing happened. Door swung open exactly 6 inches during the eulogy. Stayed that way until the service ended. This time, Michael's father noticed. He wants us to follow him, Roberto Rodriguez said, tears streaming down his face. He doesn't want to go alone. I started watching the door more carefully during children's services. Adult services, it stayed closed without fail. But whenever we gathered to remember a child under 10, that oak door would swing open precisely 6 inches at some point during the eulogy, always during my speech about how the deceased had touched our lives. Never during prayers or music, only when I was talking about the child's impact on their family and community. The security footage confirmed what I was experiencing. Our cameras captured every service, archival recordings for families who wanted to revisit the eulogies later. When I reviewed the footage from children's services, I could see the door opening by itself, no person touching it, no visible force causing the movement, just solid oak moving with purpose, creating that 6-inch gap between worlds. But the cameras also captured something else. During Emma Chen's service, the footage showed her parents turning toward the door exactly 3 seconds before it began to open. During Michael Rodriguez's viewing, his siblings looked in that direction before any movement was visible. The children in attendance always noticed first, their heads turning toward the preparation room as if they'd heard something the adults couldn't perceive. I started asking families about their children's behavior during these services. Lucy kept saying she heard someone calling her name, explained one mother after her daughter's friend's funeral. She wanted to go see who it was, but I made her stay in her seat. My son asked if he could go play with Tommy, said another father. Said Tommy was lonely and wanted friends to come with him. The children attending these services could hear something the adults couldn't. Voices calling them toward that open door. Invitations to join friends who'd gone ahead to whatever place children go when life ends too soon. I consulted our family priest, Father Miguel Santos, who'd been blessing our chapel services for 15 years. He listened to my account with the patient attention of someone who'd encountered mysteries that couldn't be explained by theology alone. Children see things differently, he said thoughtfully. They haven't learned yet that death is supposed to be final. Maybe that door opens because the children who've passed on know their friends can still hear them calling. That explanation felt right in ways that mechanical failure never could. I stopped trying to fix the door after that. Started thinking of it as a feature rather than a problem. A gateway that opened when children needed to know their departed friends were still connected to them somehow. The families seemed to find comfort in it too, seeing the open door as evidence that their children weren't alone in death. But I also started paying closer attention to the living children who attended these services. Some would stare at the open door with a kind of longing that worried me. Others seemed drawn toward it, taking steps in that direction before parents gently guided them back to their seats. A few asked direct questions that chilled me. Can I go see Emma? Will Tommy show me where he went? Why can't we follow them? I began ending children's services with specific words about staying with their families, about how the children who died wanted their friends to live full, happy lives before any reunions happened. The door would close during these closing remarks, as if the departed children understood they needed to wait patiently for their friends to join them in their own time. Last month, we held services for 6-year-old Ana Martinez, brain cancer. Her best friend Sophie, age 7, attended with her parents. During the eulogy, the door swung open right on schedule. Sophie immediately looked toward it, then stood up in her pew. "Anna," she called out, her voice carrying clearly through the chapel. "I can hear you." Her parents tried to quiet her, but Sophie kept talking to the open doorway. "I can't come yet, Anna. Mama says I have to wait, but I can hear you singing our song." The door stayed open longer than usual that day, 15 minutes, instead of the usual 5 or 6. When it finally closed, Sophie waved goodbye to empty air, then sat down and didn't speak for the rest of the service. After everyone left, I asked Sophie's mother what song she'd been referring to. "They made up a silly song about butterflies," she explained. "Sang it constantly during Anna's treatment. I hadn't heard it mentioned since Anna got too sick to play. The door still opens during children's services, that sacred 6-inch gap between this world and whatever comes next. I've learned to expect it, to work it into my eulogies, as a sign that love transcends death and friendship knows no boundaries. But I also watch the living children more carefully now, making sure they understand that some calls must wait to be answered, and some doors shouldn't be followed until much later in life. Death keeps its own appointment calendar. I'm Ruth Blackwood, office manager at Serenity Funeral Home for the past 16 years. My job is organization scheduling services, coordinating with cemeteries, making sure every detail runs smoothly when families are too grief-stricken to handle logistics themselves. It's detail-oriented work that requires precision, because mistakes during someone's final arrangements can cause pain that lasts for generations. The appointment cards started appearing in November of 2018. I arrived Monday morning to find a card on my desk, filled out in elegant handwriting that belonged to another era, Margaret Henley. It read, "Viewing arrangements Tuesday, whenever the sun sets." No contact information, no family details, no indication of how the card had gotten there. My first thought was that someone had dropped it off after hours, slipped it through our mail slot for me to find Monday morning. Elderly clients sometimes preferred handwritten notes to phone calls, especially when discussing arrangements that reminded them of their own mortality. But we had no Margaret Henley in our current files. No services scheduled for Tuesday. I spent an hour checking our records, active files, completed arrangements, even accounts dating back 5 years. No Margaret Henley anywhere in our system. I called our answering service to see if anyone had left messages over the weekend. Nothing. Tuesday morning brought another card. Robert Chen, memorial service Wednesday, whenever the sun sets. Same elegant handwriting. Same impossible timing. This card had appeared overnight in my locked desk drawer, placed carefully on top of my appointment calendar, as if someone had wanted to make sure I wouldn't miss it. I checked the locks on our building, tested the security system, verified that no one had access codes except myself and our director. Everything was secure. No signs of entry, no indication that anyone had been in the building after hours. Just another appointment card from someone who didn't exist, requesting services we weren't scheduled to provide. By the end of November, I had 12 cards. Each one requested the same thing: services, whenever the sun sets, always for the following day. The names were different, but the handwriting remained consistent, as if the same person was making appointments for multiple clients. I started photographing each card before filing them away, creating a record of something that shouldn't have been happening. The breakthrough came when I decided to research the names. Margaret Henley had died in 1943, according to obituary records in our local historical society's archives. Heart attack, age 67. Services held at Serenity Funeral Home during the first year of our operation. The obituary mentioned that her service was held at sunset, per her final wishes, so she could watch the sun go down one last time. Robert Chen, 1951. Car accident, age 34. Services at Serenity, at sunset, as he had always loved the evening hours when he finished work for the day. Every name on every card belonged to someone who died decades ago. All had been clients of Serenity Funeral Home. All had requested sunset services, back when such timing was more common than today's scheduled appointment slots. I brought my findings to our director, Paul Morrison, whose grandfather had founded Serenity in 1942. Paul listened with the kind of patience that comes from 70-plus years of family experience in the funeral business. "Grandfather always said this place held on to memories," Paul said thoughtfully. "Claimed the building, remembered every service, every family, every goodbye that happened here. We used to do a lot of sunset services back then. People thought it was more peaceful, more natural than rigid scheduling." He paused, studying the appointment cards I'd collected. Maybe the building is just trying to keep those old appointments making sure no one gets forgotten. That explanation felt right, though it didn't answer how the cards were appearing in my locked desk drawer. I started leaving my desk unlocked, curious to see if that would change anything. Tuesday morning, I found a card on my chair instead of in the drawer. Wednesday, it was tucked under my computer keyboard. Thursday, placed carefully on top of my coffee mug where I couldn't miss it. The handwriting never varied, always the same elegant script that suggested fountain pens and careful penmanship lessons. Always the same request for sunset services. Always names from Serenity's distant past. People who'd been dead longer than I'd been alive. By Christmas, I'd developed a routine. Each morning, I'd find the new appointment card and research the name. Read their obituary, learn something about their life, understand why they'd chosen sunset for their final service. Then I'd file the card with the others. A growing collection of appointments that would never be kept but somehow still mattered. The names told stories of ordinary people who'd lived through extraordinary times. World War II veterans who'd wanted to watch one last sunset before eternal night. Depression-era farmers who'd scheduled services after the day's work was done. Mothers who'd requested evening services so their children could attend after school. All of them had trusted Serenity with their final arrangements. All of them had chosen sunset timing for deeply personal reasons. And somehow, decades later, they were still making appointments, still trusting us to remember their preferences, even though their services were long over. I stopped trying to solve the mystery after that. Started thinking of the cards as a privilege rather than a problem. Daily reminders that our work extends beyond the immediate grief of current families. We're also custodians of memory, keepers of final wishes, guardians of appointments that transcend time. But last month, something changed. The appointment card I found Monday morning was different. Instead of a decades-old name, it read, Ruth Blackwood, Retirement Celebration, whenever the sun sets. The handwriting was the same elegant script, but the appointment was for me scheduled exactly 1 week before my planned retirement from Serenity. I haven't told Paul about that card yet. Haven't decided whether it's a gentle reminder that my own time at Serenity is ending or something more significant. But I've been paying attention to sunsets lately, watching the way light fades gradually into darkness, thinking about transitions and final appointments, and the strange comfort of having someone remember your preferences even when you haven't made the request yourself. The cards still appear each morning, appointment reminders from people who understand that some schedules transcend death. I'll be leaving soon, but I have a feeling whoever takes my desk will find their own collection starting, their own daily connection to the past that shaped this place. Because Serenity Funeral Home keeps all its appointments, even the ones made by people who've been gone for decades. Some commitments are meant to last forever. Some graves exist only in the space between official records and impossible truth. I'm Tom Bradley, records keeper at Greenwood Cemetery for the past 18 years. My job is documentation, maintaining burial records, updating plot maps, ensuring every grave has proper paperwork tracing back to the original purchase. It's meticulous work that requires attention to detail, because cemetery records are legal documents that families depend on when they need to locate their loved ones decades after burial. The phantom documents started appearing in my filing cabinet in March of 2021. I discovered them during routine record organization, manila folders tucked between legitimate files as if they'd always belonged there. Each contained complete burial documentation, purchase agreements, death certificates, funeral director signatures for graves that didn't exist on any cemetery map I'd ever seen. The first folder was labeled Margaret Sullivan, Plot 73B, Section 9. According to the paperwork, she'd been buried in 1958. After dying of pneumonia at age 42, the documentation looked authentic, correct forms, proper stamps, signatures from funeral directors who'd worked at local establishments decades ago. But Section 9 at Greenwood only had 60 plots, numbered 1 through 60. There was no Plot 73B anywhere in our cemetery. I checked the master maps, the original survey documents, even the city planning records from when Greenwood was established in 1923. Section 9 had always been designed for 60 plots, never more. Yet, here was official paperwork claiming Margaret Sullivan had been buried in a grave that couldn't exist. The signatures bothered me most. The funeral director listed was Harold Morrison, whose name I recognized from old records. He'd worked at Morrison Family Chapel from 1945 to 1972, buried hundreds of people at Greenwood during those years. His signature on Margaret Sullivan's documents matched the handwriting on legitimate burial forms from the same era. I found 6 more phantom folders that week. Different names, different burial dates spanning 30 years, all claiming graves in sections that either didn't exist or had plot numbers beyond our actual capacity. Robert Chen in Plot 95C of Section 4, which only went to Plot 80. Dorothy Vance in Plot 120A of Section 12, though that section had never expanded beyond Plot 100. Every document appeared authentic. Every signature belonged to real funeral directors or cemetery officials from the appropriate time periods. Every death certificate showed proper state registration numbers that would have been valid when issued, but every grave location was impossible according to our actual layout. I brought the folders to our cemetery director, Patricia Wells, who'd been managing Greenwood for 25 years. She examined the documents with the thoroughness of someone who'd dealt with record-keeping mysteries before. "These look legitimate," she said finally, "but the plot locations are all wrong. Either someone made massive documentation errors decades ago, or..." She didn't finish the thought. I spent the following month investigating the impossible grave sites. Plot 73B in Section 9 would have been located in the northeast corner of that section, if it existed. When I walked the area, I found normal grass and landscaping, no indication of any grave. But the ground felt different, somehow softer underfoot, as if the earth had been disturbed long ago and never quite settled properly. I borrowed a soil probe from our groundskeeping crew and tested the area. 3 feet down, I hit something solid, not bedrock or utilities, something that felt like wood. Old wood, the kind that comes from caskets buried decades ago. The other phantom plot locations showed similar anomalies. Soft ground where graves couldn't exist, soil probe hits that suggested burial sites in impossible places. Each location corresponded exactly to the coordinates listed in the phantom documentation, as if someone had buried people in graves that were somehow invisible to official mapping. The breakthrough came when I researched the names on the phantom documents. Margaret Sullivan had lived in our town from 1915 until her death in 1958. Local newspaper archives showed she'd been a teacher at the elementary school, active in church activities, well known in the community. Her obituary mentioned that she'd been buried at Greenwood Cemetery in the family plot she'd selected years earlier, but there was no record of any Sullivan family purchasing plots at Greenwood. No legitimate documentation of her burial anywhere in our files. Robert Chen's story was similar. Longtime resident, respected businessman, obituary confirming burial at Greenwood, in a plot that didn't officially exist. Dorothy Vance, same pattern. All real people, all confirmed burials, all resting in graves that had no legal existence, according to our records. I started checking with other local cemeteries, wondering if the documentation had been misfiled decades ago. St. Mary's, Hillcrest, Oakwood, none had any record of these individuals. According to official documentation, they'd been buried at Greenwood in plots that couldn't exist. The answer came from an unexpected source, my predecessor's personal notes. William Harper had been records keeper at Greenwood from 1978 to 2003, when he retired. His family donated his professional materials to our archive, including handwritten journals where he'd recorded unusual incidents and record-keeping challenges over the years. In his 1992 journal, I found this entry: "Found more impossible graves today. Ground probe confirms burial sites in areas that don't match any official maps. Starting to think Greenwood is bigger than we know. Extends into spaces that exist between what's documented and what's real. Harper had encountered the same phantom graves I was finding. According to his notes, he documented over 30 burial sites that existed physically but not officially. Grave locations that could be verified with soil probes but never appeared on any map or survey. His final entry on the subject was chilling. The cemetery keeps its own records. Some burials happen in the spaces between official plots, graves that exist only for people who need to be buried but can't be documented. The dead find their own places to rest. I tested Harper's theory by walking Greenwood's perimeter with the soil probe, checking areas beyond our official boundaries. Found burial sites in the woods behind Section 12, graves hidden under decades of leaf cover and new growth. Discovered more burials in the field adjacent to Section 4, unmarked graves in ground that technically belonged to the city but had never been developed. Greenwood Cemetery was larger than its official maps indicated, extending into liminal spaces where the dead had made their own arrangements. The phantom documentation was accurate. People were buried in those impossible plots, just not in locations that appeared on any living person's map. I started visiting these phantom grave sites regularly, trying to understand how they functioned outside normal cemetery operations. The areas where graves couldn't exist, according to our records, consistently showed signs of care. Patches where grass grew differently, spots where wildflowers appeared in patterns that suggested intentional planting, subtle maintenance that couldn't be attributed to our groundskeeping staff. The most disturbing discovery came when I realized the phantom graves were still receiving visitors. During early morning walks through the unofficial sections, I'd find fresh flowers placed on unmarked ground, small stones arranged in patterns that suggested memorial rituals, even handwritten notes tucked under rocks or tied to nearby trees. These weren't random litter, they were offerings, placed with the kind of care that comes from people visiting loved ones. But how were families finding graves that didn't appear on any map? I started leaving my business card at phantom grave sites, hoping someone would contact me with information. 3 weeks later, I received a call from Eleanor Martinez, an elderly woman whose voice carried the weight of old grief. "You left a card at my husband's grave," she said. "Plot 95C, Section 4. I've been visiting him there for 20 years, ever since he died." I explained that no such plot existed in our official records, that Section 4 only went to Plot 80. Eleanor listened patiently, then gave me directions that led exactly to one of the phantom burial sites I'd documented. "The cemetery told me where to find him," she explained, when I asked how she'd located the grave. "Not any person, the place itself. After Roberto's funeral, I came looking for his grave, but couldn't find it on any map. I walked around for hours, getting more and more upset. Then I heard him calling my name." She paused, gathering courage to continue. "I followed his voice to that spot in the woods behind Section 4. There's no headstone, but I know he's there. The ground told me so." I visited Eleanor's phantom gravesite with her the following week. She moved through the woods with absolute certainty, leading me to a clearing where the soil probe confirmed burial remains. As we stood there, she began talking to the ground, sharing news about their grandchildren and neighborhood gossip, maintaining a conversation that had continued for 20 years. "Other people visit here too," she mentioned as we prepared to leave. "I've seen them, always older folks, always talking to the ground like I do." We nod at each other but don't usually talk. Everyone understands this is a private place. That explained the fresh flowers and memorial offerings I'd been finding. Families who'd lost people buried in phantom graves, guided by something beyond official maps to find their loved ones in impossible locations. I stopped trying to reconcile the phantom documents with our official records after that. Started thinking of them as a parallel filing system, documentation for a cemetery that existed alongside Greenwood's mapped sections, but operated by different rules. The dead who needed to be buried but couldn't fit into official plots found their own spaces, created their own records, maintained their own connections with the living. The phantom folders still appear in my filing cabinet, usually during times when our official sections are approaching capacity. Perfect documentation for graves that exist in the spaces between what's mapped and what's needed. Burial sites for people who slip through the cracks of official record keeping but still deserve a place to rest. I've learned to trust the phantom documentation, to file it carefully alongside our legitimate records. Because some graves exist in the space between official maps and desperate love, where families can find their dead even when no surveyor ever recorded the coordinates. Greenwood Cemetery keeps growing, extending into impossible spaces where the dead make their own arrangements and the living follow invisible directions to find exactly what they're looking for. Time moves differently for mourners who never learned they were dead. I'm Diane Walsh, night security guard at Peaceful Acres Cemetery for the past 11 years. The job suits me: quiet hours, solitary work, time to think, while making sure vandals and trespassers don't disturb the peace that families need when they visit their loved ones. Most nights pass without incident, just me and the security monitors and the respectful silence that settles over places where grief goes to heal. The three mourners first appeared on camera 14 months ago. I was doing my midnight rounds when motion sensors triggered the camera system for Section C, our oldest area dating back to the 1920s. The monitors showed three figures moving slowly between headstones, two women and one man, all dressed in clothes that belonged to another era. Dark suits and long coats, the kind of formal attire people wore to funerals when ceremony mattered more than convenience. My first assumption was reenactors or historians, people who sometimes visited old cemeteries to research local history. But they were there at 1 a.m, moving with the purposeful grief of people attending a fresh burial. They placed flowers at different graves, stood in silent prayer, performed the rituals of mourning with practiced solemnity. I watched them through the security system for exactly 11 minutes, then checked the perimeter to see how they'd entered. Our gates lock automatically at dusk, and the fence around Peaceful Acres is 8 feet high with no obvious breach points. But I found no signs of forced entry, no indication of how 3 people had gotten inside without triggering our alarm system. When I checked the cameras again, they were gone. The next night, they returned to different graves. Same 3 people, same formal attire, same 11-minute ritual of placing flowers and standing in respectful silence. This time I decided to investigate directly, leaving my security office to approach Section C on foot. But when I reached the area where the cameras showed them standing, I found only empty paths and sleeping headstones. I could see them clearly on my handheld monitor, 3 figures continuing their mourning rituals just 30 feet from where I stood searching empty air. The cameras recorded their presence while my eyes saw nothing, as if they existed in a parallel space that technology could detect but human perception couldn't access. Over the following weeks, I documented their visits carefully. They appeared every night between 1 and 1:15 in the morning, always in different sections of the cemetery, always visiting graves from the 1920s through 1940s. Their clothing never changed: the same formal black attire, the same careful movements of people who'd learned proper funeral etiquette in an era when such things mattered deeply. The flowers they carried appeared to be carnations and lilies, arranged in the simple bouquets common during their apparent time period. They would approach each grave individually, place their offerings with reverent care, then stand together in silent prayer before moving to the next headstone. Every ritual lasted exactly 11 minutes, timed with the precision of people following familiar customs. I began researching the graves they visited, looking for connections that might explain their nightly rounds. The headstones they honored belonged to people who died between 1923 and 1946, mostly during the Great Depression and World War II. Natural deaths, accidents, war casualties, a cross-section of mortality from decades when death was more present in daily life. No obvious family connections linked the graves, No single tragedy that might bind these people together in death. But I noticed something else. None of the graves they visited ever received flowers from living relatives. While researching obituaries from that era, I discovered that all three of my mysterious mourners had died during the same time period they were now honoring. Margaret Wilson, 1938, pneumonia at age 34. Robert Henderson, 1941, factory accident at age 29. Dorothy Chen, 1946, complications from childbirth at age 26. All three had been buried at Peaceful Acres. All three had died young, leaving behind lives that felt unfinished. And somehow, they'd found each other in death, forming their own mourning society to honor the forgotten dead of their generation. The pattern became clear once I understood their mission. They visited graves that had been abandoned by time, people whose children had died or moved away, whose grandchildren didn't know they existed, whose final resting places had become anonymous dots on cemetery maps. My three mourners were ensuring that no one from their era died twice, first in body and then in memory. I started leaving flowers at graves after their visits, maintaining their work during daylight hours when living hands could tend to the abandoned dead. It seemed right somehow, a partnership between the security guard who protected the cemetery's peace and the phantom mourners who protected its forgotten residents from the final indignity of being unmourned. But last month, something changed in their routine. Instead of visiting different graves each night, they began returning to the same three headstones in Section C, their own graves, where their names were carved in stone that had weathered decades of seasons. They would stand at their own memorials, placing flowers for themselves, mourning their own lost lives with the same reverence they'd shown the abandoned dead. I watched them through the security cameras, these three young people who died before their time, finally acknowledging their own need for remembrance. They aged backward during these visits, beginning each night looking worn by decades of mourning others, gradually becoming the young adults they'd been when death interrupted their plans. Margaret Wilson would smooth her hair and adjust her dress, becoming again the 34-year-old woman who died before seeing her children grow up. Robert Henderson would straighten his shoulders, transforming back into the 29-year-old who'd been planning to propose to his girlfriend when the factory accident changed everything. Dorothy Chen would cradle her arms as if holding the baby she died bringing into the world. For 11 minutes each night, they were themselves, again, not eternal mourners but young people, with lives that had been cut short, dreams that deserved to be remembered, love stories that had ended before their final chapters. Then they would fade, becoming invisible even to the cameras, their work complete for another night. I still watch the monitors during those late hours, but the three mourners haven't appeared for 2 weeks now. I think they've finally found peace, having learned that mourning others can eventually heal the wounds of your own unmourned death. They spent decades ensuring the forgotten dead were remembered, and in doing so, they remembered themselves. The flowers I leave at their graves now are from me, a living person honoring three souls who taught me that love extends beyond death, that some people are too generous to rest until everyone else has been comforted first. The security cameras still capture strange movements sometimes, brief shadows that might be Margaret, Robert, and Dorothy making their rounds. But they move differently now, lighter, more peaceful, like people who've finally learned that they too deserve to be mourned, to be remembered, to rest in the peace they spent so many years giving others. The dead have their own conversations, discussing lives that ended decades ago. I'm Luis Santos, crematorium technician at Valley Memorial Services for the past 14 years. It's precise work operating equipment that reduces human remains to ash with dignity and care, ensuring families receive exactly what they need for their final arrangements. Most people find crematorium work unsettling, but I've always found peace in it. The quiet efficiency, the respectful process, the knowledge that I'm helping families move through grief toward acceptance. The voices started during the late shift in September of 2022. I was cleaning the preparation room after completing Mrs. Anderson's cremation when I heard conversation coming from the adjacent chamber. Soft voices, two people discussing something in the kind of intimate tones used for private family matters. My first thought was that mourners had somehow entered the building after hours, though our security system hadn't registered any alerts. I moved toward the preparation room to investigate, but the voices stopped the moment I approached the door. When I entered, the room was empty, clean equipment, proper lighting, no sign that anyone had been there. But the air felt warm, as if heated by recent conversation, and I caught the faint scent of roses, though we hadn't used any floral arrangements that day. I checked the building thoroughly, tested all the locks, verified that the security system was functioning properly. Everything was secure. No unauthorized entry, no explanation for the voices I'd clearly heard discussing family news and neighborhood gossip in the empty preparation room. The conversations resumed 3 nights later. Same soft voices, same intimate tone, but this time I could make out fragments of what they were saying. 2 elderly women discussing someone named Margaret's hip surgery, comparing notes about their grandchildren's progress in school, sharing the kind of everyday updates that families exchange over Sunday dinner. I listened from the hallway, not wanting to interrupt but trying to understand what was happening. The voices were distinctly different, one with a slight southern accent, the other more clipped and precise in her pronunciation. Both spoke with the careful diction of people who'd grown up, when proper speech mattered more than casual conversation. When I finally entered the preparation room, silence fell immediately. But this time, the warmth lingered longer, and I noticed something else, 2 impressions in the padded preparation table, as if 2 people had been sitting there having their conversation. I started keeping a journal of the incidents, documenting times and details of each occurrence. The voices appeared most often during late evening hours, always when I was working alone in the crematorium. Always the same 2 women, discussing mundane details of lives that seemed to belong to another era. They talked about rationing during wartime, about children who'd grown up and moved to cities with strange names, about neighbors whose stories suggested small-town life from decades past. By November, I'd identified patterns in their conversations. They always discussed people in past tense, as if everyone they'd known was dead. They mentioned events from the 1940s and 50s, the end of World War II, the Korean conflict, the introduction of television to their neighborhood. Their conversation topics suggested they'd been friends for many years, sharing the kind of comfortable intimacy that comes from growing old together. Most significantly, they talked about their own deaths. "I still can't believe Harold went first," one would say. "Spent 60 years expecting to outlive him, and then that heart attack took him so sudden." "At least you got to say goodbye," the other would respond. "Cancer gave me 6 months to see it coming, but I still wasn't ready when the time came." They were dead women, continuing conversations that had been interrupted by mortality, discussing their own deaths with the bewildered acceptance of people still adjusting to no longer being alive. I researched recent cremations, looking for connections to the voices I was hearing. Dorothy Henderson, cremated in August, age 86. Born 1936, widowed in 2018 when her husband Harold died of a heart attack. According to her obituary, she'd been active in local church activities and known for her Sunday dinners that brought together friends and neighbors. Margaret Wilson, cremated in September, age 84, born 1938, died of cancer after a 6-month illness. Her obituary mentioned a lifelong friendship with Dorothy Henderson, dating back to when they'd been neighbors as young wives in the 1960s. Dorothy and Margaret, best friends in life, now continuing their friendship in death, meeting in the crematorium where their physical forms had been transformed to ash while their essential selves remained connected. I stopped trying to interrupt their conversations after that understanding. Instead, I would work quietly in adjacent areas, allowing them privacy for discussions that had been cut short by death. Their voices became a comfort during long night shifts, evidence that connection transcends physical existence and friendship survives even cremation. But I also began paying attention to what they discussed. These two women processing their own deaths through gentle conversation. They talked about regrets, words left unspoken, places they'd never visited, recipes they'd forgotten to write down for their daughters. They discussed surprise at being dead, confusion about how consciousness could continue when bodies had been reduced to ash. They wondered about children who were now middle-aged adults, grandchildren they'd never see graduate from college, great-grandchildren who would know them only through stories. Most poignantly, they mourned the end of their weekly coffee visits, the Thursday afternoon tradition that had sustained their friendship for 40 years, until illness made travel impossible. "I missed you so much those last months," Dorothy would say. "Couldn't drive anymore. Couldn't make it to your house for coffee." "I know, honey," Margaret would respond. "I missed you too. Cancer made everything so hard toward the end." Their conversations were grief work, processing loss, while maintaining the connection that had defined their friendship. They were helping each other understand death, the same way they'd helped each other understand life, through patient listening and gentle support. Last month, their conversations began to change. Instead of discussing regrets and confusion, they started talking about peace, about feeling ready to move on, about understanding that their friendship had served its purpose in both life and death. They talked about light they could see in the distance, about family members calling their names from somewhere beyond the crematorium's walls. "I think it's time," Dorothy said during their most recent conversation. "I think so too," Margaret agreed. "We've said what we needed to say." The voices stopped coming after that. The preparation room remains quiet during late shifts, the warmth and rose scent replaced by normal temperature and chemical odors. Dorothy and Margaret have moved on to whatever comes after the transitional space where the recently dead process their transformation from living to eternal. But I still feel their presence sometimes, a sense of gratitude that lingers in the crematorium's quiet spaces. They taught me that death isn't an ending but a transformation, and that some friendships are strong enough to continue even after bodies become ash. The echo chamber is silent now, but it served its purpose, providing a space where two friends could finish conversations that mortality had interrupted, could say goodbye properly before moving on to whatever lies beyond. What we bury with the dead sometimes finds its way back to the living. I'm Ann Carter, funeral coordinator at Restful Gardens Memorial Home for the past 13 years. My job involves helping families navigate the hundreds of decisions that death requires: flowers, music, casket selections, and the deeply personal choice of what items to bury with their loved ones. Wedding rings, photographs, letters, small treasures that connect the living to the dead across the boundary that separates this world from whatever comes next. The returned items started appearing last October. I arrived Monday morning to find a wedding ring on the reception desk, positioned carefully on a folded handkerchief beside our guest registry. The ring was engraved with initials RMDM forever, and showed the kind of wear that comes from decades of faithful wearing. I recognized it immediately. We'd buried it with Robert Martinez 3 days earlier, placed on his finger at his widow's request so he wouldn't face eternity alone. My first thought was theft. Someone had disturbed Mr. Martinez's grave, taken his ring, then had second thoughts and returned it anonymously. But when I called Greenwood Cemetery to report possible vandalism, they confirmed his grave showed no signs of disturbance. The earth was undisturbed, the flowers still fresh, everything exactly as it had been after the burial service. I called Mrs. Martinez to explain the situation. She listened quietly, then asked me to describe the ring in detail. When I mentioned the handkerchief it had been placed on, she began crying. "That's my handkerchief," she said through tears. "The one I used to pack his lunch every day for 38 years. I put it in his jacket pocket for the burial, something that smelled like home." Both items had been buried with Robert Martinez, sealed in his casket, lowered 6 feet underground 3 days earlier. There was no rational explanation for how they'd ended up on my reception desk. carefully arranged, as if someone wanted to make sure I'd notice them. I secured both items in our safe and decided to wait before taking any further action. Tuesday morning brought a photograph. The image showed a young couple at their wedding, circa 1955, based on the clothing and styling. The woman's dress was elegant but simple, the man handsome in his military uniform. On the back, someone had written, "Thomas and Eleanor, June 15, 1955, our beginning." I recognized it as the photograph Eleanor Vance's children had placed in her hands before we closed her casket the previous week. Wednesday brought a letter, still in its envelope, postmarked 1943. The return address showed Private James Sullivan with a military postal code. Inside, a love letter written in careful handwriting. "My dearest Margaret, I think about you every day and dream about the life we'll build when this war is over." Margaret Sullivan had been buried holding that letter, her final connection to a husband who died in France before he could come home to build their promised life. By the end of October, my reception desk had become a collection point for memories that refused to stay buried. Jewelry, photographs, letters, small personal items that families had chosen to send with their loved ones into whatever lies beyond death. Each item appeared overnight, placed with care on my desk, as if someone was making deliberate deliveries. Nothing was damaged or disturbed. These weren't the random takings of grave robbers, but the purposeful returns of someone who understood the significance of each object. I started researching the pattern, looking for connections between the returned items and the people they'd been buried with. Robert Martinez, married 52 years, died holding his wife's hand while she whispered promises to love him forever. Eleanor Vance, widow for 30 years, buried with her wedding photo because her children knew she'd never stopped missing her husband. Margaret Sullivan, who'd waited 4 years for a husband who never came home from war, finally buried with his last letter when she died at age 93. All were people who died with love unfinished, stories incomplete, connections that transcended death but couldn't be fully expressed in the grave. The breakthrough came when I decided to stay late one evening, hoping to catch whoever was making these mysterious deliveries. I positioned myself in the office adjacent to the reception area, lights dimmed, with a clear view of the front desk where the items had been appearing. At 11:47, I saw movement, not a person entering the building, but objects materializing on the desk, as if they were being placed by invisible hands. A pocket watch appeared first, settling onto the polished wood with the soft tick of a timepiece that had kept accurate time for decades. Then came a small music box, its lid opening to play a few notes of "The Way You Look Tonight," before closing again. Finally, a bundle of letters tied with a ribbon, the pages yellowed with age but the ink still clear. I watched these items appear without any visible agent placing them, manifestations of memory made physical through some process I couldn't understand but couldn't deny. The items belonged to Harold Chen, buried the previous afternoon, with objects his daughter had chosen to represent his 91 years of life. The pocket watch had been his father's, carried through 2 wars and 40 years of railroad work. The music box had played the song he'd danced to with his wife on their wedding night. The letters were every note she'd written him during their courtship, saved and treasured for 70 years of marriage. But these weren't random grave goods being returned. They were gifts. I found a note the next morning, written in Harold's distinctive handwriting, that I recognized from documents his family had provided. "For my Sarah, so she remembers our time wasn't wasted. The watch still keeps good time, the music box still plays our song, and the letters still hold all the love I couldn't say enough while I was alive." Harold Chen was returning his most precious possessions to his daughter, not because he didn't need them in death, but because she needed them more in life. The dead, I realized, sometimes give back what the living need in most tangible, proof that love survives separation, and memory becomes its own kind of treasure. I started facilitating these returns, meeting with families to deliver items that their loved ones had apparently decided to share rather than keep. The conversations were difficult, but healing children, receiving final gifts from parents, spouses getting back wedding rings that had completed their purpose in the grave, families understanding that love finds ways to bridge the space between living and dead. The reception desk still receives mysterious deliveries, objects that refuse to stay buried because the dead understand that some memories are too precious to keep underground. I've learned to recognize the difference between theft and gift, between loss and intentional return, because sometimes what we bury with the dead comes back to us, transformed not as abandoned possessions, but as final expressions of love from people who've learned that the most meaningful gifts are the ones we give away. The dead keep their own guest list, signing in for reunions that transcend time. I'm Michael Torres, chapel attendant at Sacred Heart Memorial Chapel for the past 7 years. My responsibilities include maintaining the facility, setting up for services, and managing the guest registry where mourners sign their names to show they attended a funeral. It's simple work with profound purpose, ensuring families have a record of who came to honor their loved ones during their time of greatest need. The phantom signatures started appearing last winter. I noticed them during my morning routine, checking the guest registry from Mrs. Patterson's service the previous day. Below the names of family and friends who'd attended her funeral, I found 3 additional signatures written in elegant script that belonged to another era. Margaret Wilson, Robert Chen, and Dorothy Vasquez, all signed with fountain pen ink in handwriting that suggested formal penmanship education from decades past. None of those names had been on our service list. I'd greeted every person who'd attended Mrs. Patterson's funeral, and our chapel had held only 23 mourners for her quiet service. But there were 26 signatures in the registry, including 3 from people who'd apparently attended without my knowledge. I checked our security footage, reviewing the entire service from setup to cleanup. The cameras showed exactly 23 attendees, the same faces I'd counted in person, the same number of signatures I'd expected to find. No additional mourners, no explanation for the extra names in elegant script. I researched the phantom signatures, expecting to find they were somehow connected to Mrs. Patterson's family. Margaret Wilson had died in 1968, according to local obituary records. Heart attack at age 72. Services held at Sacred Heart Memorial Chapel 54 years earlier. Robert Chen, 1971. Cancer at age 68. Also memorialized at our chapel. Dorothy Vasquez, 1973. Stroke at age 75. Another Sacred Heart service from decades past. All 3 had been honored in our chapel. All had died long before Mrs. Patterson was even born. Yet somehow their names appeared in her guest registry, signed with the kind of care that suggested personal attendance at her funeral. The pattern became clear over the following months. Every funeral at Sacred Heart collected additional signatures from people who'd been memorialized in our chapel decades earlier. Never random names, always people whose own services had been held in the same sanctuary where current families gathered to mourn. The phantom mourners seemed to be attending funerals as a form of community support, offering comfort to grieving families from beyond the grave. I started tracking the phantom signatures carefully, documenting names and researching their histories. Without exception, they belonged to people who'd been known for kindness during their lifetimes: teachers, nurses, volunteer firefighters, church ladies who'd organized countless community meals, people who'd spent their lives comforting others during difficult times. The signatures always appeared in chronological order of death. Oldest phantom mourners first, most recent additions at the bottom. They wrote with the same fountain pen ink, the same elegant script, as if they were using a registration system that existed in whatever realm they now occupied. But the most striking pattern was when the signatures appeared most frequently. Funerals for elderly people who'd outlived most of their friends collected the most phantom signatures, Services for individuals who died alone, with few family members remaining to mourn them, would sometimes have more phantom attendees than living ones. The dead, it seemed, were ensuring that no one left this world unmourned, that every funeral had sufficient attendance to honor a life well lived. I decided to test my theory during Mr. Robinson's service in April. George Robinson had died at age 94, outliving his wife, his siblings, and most of his friends. His funeral attracted only 6 living mourners: a great-nephew from out of state, 2 neighbors, and 3 members of his former church. It was a sparse gathering for someone who'd lived nearly a century, taught high school mathematics for 40 years, and volunteered with literacy programs until he was 88. I watched the guest registry carefully throughout the service, checking it periodically to see when additional signatures might appear. During the eulogy, when the 6 living attendees were focused on the chaplain's words, I counted 16 new signatures appearing in the book Phantom Mourners, signing in with their characteristic elegant script. After the service, I researched the names. All had been educators, volunteers, or community servants who'd been memorialized at Sacred Heart over the past 60 years. They'd recognized George Robinson as one of their own and attended his funeral to ensure he received the honor his lifetime of service deserved. The phantom signatures became a source of comfort for me, evidence that death doesn't end community or compassion. Families began asking about the additional names in their registries, and I developed a gentle explanation about memorial signatures from previous chapel families, a way of describing the phenomenon without adding to their grief. But last month, something changed in the pattern. Instead of appearing only during funerals, the phantom signatures began showing up on anniversary dates, the day each phantom mourner had died. Margaret Wilson's signature appeared every March 15th, the anniversary of her death. Robert Chen signed in every October 3rd. Dorothy Vasquez every December 7th. They were marking their own death anniversaries by visiting the chapel where they'd been mourned decades earlier, perhaps finding comfort in the familiar sanctuary where their own lives had been celebrated and their own families had said goodbye. I started leaving flowers in the chapel on these anniversary dates, small arrangements that honored the phantom mourners who'd given so much comfort to current families. It seemed appropriate that someone should remember their deaths the way they'd been remembering others, that their own anniversaries should be marked with the respect they'd shown countless grieving families. The most moving discovery came when I realized the phantom mourners were also attending each other's anniversary services. On Margaret Wilson's death anniversary, Robert Chen and Dorothy Vasquez's signatures would appear alongside hers. When Robert Chen's date arrived, Margaret and Dorothy would sign in to commemorate their friend's passing. They'd found each other in death the way they'd served their community in life, by showing up for each other during significant moments. The guest registry still collects phantom signatures, names from Sacred Heart's past, ensuring that current families feel the full weight of community support during their time of loss. I've learned to expect the elegant script, to research the names that appear without corresponding bodies, to understand that some attendees exist beyond the reach of security cameras, but not beyond the reach of compassion. Because love doesn't end with death, and some mourners continue attending funerals long after their own services have concluded. They sign their names in registers that bridge the gap between this world and the next, proving that the best of human nature transcends mortality and continues comforting the grieving across decades of separation. Death announces itself before it arrives. 3 soft chimes that echo from tomorrow. I'm Grace McKenna, bell tower keeper at St. Mary's Memorial Gardens for the past 19 years. My duties are simple but sacred, maintaining the memorial bells that ring for funeral services, ensuring their sound carries properly across the cemetery grounds, keeping them tuned for the solemn music that marks our final farewells. There's peace in bellwork, rhythm, and resonance that speaks to something deeper than words when families gather to honor their dead. The bells started ringing for deaths that hadn't happened yet, It began on a Tuesday morning in November when I heard three soft chimes echoing from the bell tower at exactly 6 o'clock. Not the full peal we use for services, just three gentle strikes that carried across the cemetery with unusual clarity. I checked my service schedule. No funerals planned until Thursday. No maintenance work that would require testing the system. I climbed the tower to investigate, but found everything in order. The bells hung silent and still, their bronze surfaces showing no signs of recent vibration. The mechanical systems were properly secured, the electronic controls showed no activation. Yet I distinctly heard three chimes, soft but unmistakable, ringing in the dawn silence. That afternoon, I received a call from Morrison Family Chapel. Mrs. Eleanor Davidson had passed peacefully in her sleep around 6 in the morning. Could we schedule her service for Friday? The bells had announced her death 30 minutes before anyone knew she was gone. I told myself it was coincidence. Bells sometimes ring from wind patterns or thermal expansion, creating sounds that seem meaningful but are really just mechanical response to environmental changes. St. Mary's bells were nearly 70 years old, plenty of time to develop quirks that defied easy explanation. But Thursday morning brought three more chimes at dawn, and by afternoon we had another call about arrangements for Robert Chen, who died of a heart attack while reading his morning paper. I started keeping a log of the phantom chimes, documenting times and dates alongside the death notices that followed. Within a month, the pattern was undeniable. Three soft bell strikes at dawn, followed within hours by news of someone's passing in our community. The bells had become harbingers, announcing deaths before families even knew they'd become bereaved. The chimes never came for violent deaths or accidents, only for peaceful passings that occurred during natural sleep or quiet moments. Heart attacks in favorite chairs, strokes during afternoon naps, the gentle surrenders that allow people to slip away without trauma or struggle, as if the bells could only hear deaths that came with acceptance rather than resistance. By January, I documented 12 instances of prophetic chimes. Each occurrence followed the same pattern, three gentle strikes at dawn, no mechanical explanation for the sound, followed by confirmation of a peaceful death, sometime during the night or early morning hours. The bells weren't just predicting death, they were announcing the completion of lives that had reached their natural conclusions. I shared my observations with Father Martinez, who'd been blessing our memorial services for 8 years. He listened with the patient attention of someone who'd learned that faith sometimes requires accepting mysteries rather than solving them. Perhaps the bells are offering comfort, he suggested, letting the community know when someone has found peace, preparing us to welcome their families with proper grief and support. That perspective changed how I heard the phantom chimes. Instead of omens, they became announcements of safe arrival souls reaching their final destination and ringing the bells to let loved ones know they'd made the journey successfully. I began using the dawn chimes as preparation time, ensuring the cemetery grounds were perfect for the families who would soon be making arrangements. Fresh flowers in the chapel, clean pathways, bells properly tuned for services that hadn't been scheduled yet, but would be needed within days. The most profound chiming came on a Sunday morning in March. 3 strikes at dawn, same as always. But these rang with unusual clarity and seemed to echo longer than normal. By noon, I'd received calls about 3 different deaths: Margaret Wilson, Dorothy Chen, and Robert Henderson, all longtime residents who died peacefully within hours of each other during the night. Margaret and Dorothy had been lifelong friends, neighbors for 40 years who'd planned to go together when the time came. Robert was Dorothy's brother, visiting from out of state to help care for her during her final illness. They'd all been in their 80s, all dealing with failing health, all ready for the rest that comes after long lives well lived. The triple death presented logistical challenges: 3 services to coordinate, 3 families to support, 3 sets of arrangements to make. But it also revealed something beautiful about the phantom chimes. They weren't just announcing individual deaths. They were helping the community prepare for losses that would require extra compassion and support. I worked with all three families to coordinate memorial services that honored their connections in life. Margaret and Dorothy were honored in a joint service that celebrated their friendship, while Robert's service the following day included tributes to his devotion to his sister. The bells rang properly for each service, their official chimes carrying the weight of grief and gratitude across St. Mary's grounds. But that night, as I locked up the bell tower after the day's services, I heard something that changed my understanding of the phantom chimes entirely. 3 soft strikes, just like the dawn announcements. But this time I was standing directly beneath the bells when they rang. I felt the vibrations, saw the subtle movement of bronze against bronze, watched the bells ring themselves with the kind of gentle precision that comes from invisible hands that know exactly how much pressure to apply. The bells weren't predicting death or announcing arrivals. They were being rung by the recently departed, 3 soft chimes to say goodbye to the community that had been their home, to thank the living for the love they'd shared, to mark their passing with the same reverence they'd shown for others throughout their lives. Margaret Wilson had been a church organist for 50 years, someone who understood that music marks the significant moments of human experience. Dorothy Chen had coordinated community events, someone who knew the importance of proper announcements and timing. Robert Henderson had been a clockmaker, someone who appreciated precision and the significance of marking time. Together, they'd rung the dawn bells to announce their own departures, ensuring their community would be prepared to comfort their families and celebrate their lives with appropriate ceremony. The phantom chimes still come, usually on mornings when mist rises from the cemetery grounds and the air carries sound with unusual clarity. 3 soft strikes that announce peaceful deaths, giving the community time to prepare for grief and families time to gather around love that transcends mortality. I've learned to listen for them during my early rounds, to use their gentle warning as preparation for the calls that will come later in the day. The bells ring for those who've earned peaceful endings, who've lived with enough love to warrant soft announcements of their departure. Because some deaths deserve to be announced with music, and some souls know how to ring their own farewell bells before moving on to whatever symphony awaits them in the silence beyond sound. The chimes remind me that death isn't an ending but a transition, not a silencing but a change in key from the music of life to the harmony of eternal rest. And sometimes, just sometimes, those who've learned to make beautiful music in life get to ring the bells that announce their final, perfect note.